All right, everybody. This is a podcast, discussions with Dr. D. And for this podcast, we are fortunate enough to be joined by Mr. Jock Finlayson. I will let him elaborate who he is in a moment. I met Jock this summer at a conference we were both attending. Was really impressed with his views on the Canadian economy and the present state and future prospects of. So for the next hour, that's about what we're going to discuss. And hopefully we'll get some insight into what the current challenges the country faces economically and what it might do to pull itself or make itself address those challenges. So with that, I'm just going to start us off with a conversation about who Jock actually is. So I think, Jock, you know that better than anybody else. So why don't you tell us?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. I'm one of the few people who's interested in the topic as well of who I am. So I can start. Yeah, I'm a senior fellow at the moment at the Fraser Institute, which is a market-oriented think tank founded here in Vancouver, and we now have offices in Toronto and Calgary, and one in Atlantic Canada as well. And I work primarily on Canadian kind of public policy issues, mainly in the economic area, but including immigration and energy and a few other things. That's a part-time affiliation. I'm sort of semi-retired from my actual professional career, but I am also kind of as a sideline. I'm the chief economist on a part-time basis for an organization based here in BC and Alberta called ICBA. It's the Independent Contractors and Business Association. It's the largest construction industry organization in the country by far, and I'm working part-time with them, also looking at really trends in the construction marketplace here in British Columbia and Alberta, and some of the challenges around housing affordability, the enormous complexity and cost associated with getting anything built these days, which of course very much aggravates the affordability crunch. And also, we're quite interested at ICBA in the health of the broader economy here in BC and Alberta, because construction, in economics, we would say construction demand is derived demand. It really depends on what else is happening in the economy. We don't export construction services. We provide them for the domestic marketplace. So we need a kind of thriving local economy in order to have a healthy construction business. So we work on some of the issues that affect that as well. So those are my two sort of part-time affiliations at the moment.
Well, yeah, and before that, you've been doing this a while. I noticed that you were on the board of the Bank of Canada for a while and on various other economic organizations. How did you kind of get into this as a career choice? I mean, some
Sure.
people watching might be wondering how they do that.
I'd like to say it was an intricately mapped out plan, but in fact it wasn't. I really didn't know what I wanted to do in a very specific sense. When I finished my BA in economics and political science, I actually worked as a legislative intern in the Legislative Assembly in British Columbia for a year. And I got a little bit of exposure to sort of government and politics and public policy there, and kind of sparked my interest in it. Then I went back and did a master's degree in international relations at UBC with kind of an economics focus. And during that time, I worked at a research institute at the same time as I was doing my master's. So it took about 2 years. And that really kind of exposed me to what I would describe as academic research, albeit with an applied kind of public policy bent to it. And I really enjoyed that. I kind of enjoyed the opportunity to dig into different types of literature, look at data. This was a long time ago, David. I should say for your students and others watching, this was before the computer era and way before the internet era. So research and getting data on information was a much more labor-intensive, laborious process in those days than it is today. It's obviously vastly improved. But anyway, I enjoyed that type of work, and I decided to get out of British Columbia. There was a huge recession that hit Canada in 1981, 1982, and BC was absolutely pounded by it. So I decided to get out to see if I could go to Ontario, and because I lived my whole life in BC up until then. So I thought it'd be good to get out, and I managed, after some effort, I managed to get a job at a industry organization in Ottawa, which is now called the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. And in those days, it had a different name. And I came in there as kind of a junior policy person, and really kind of built my career based on that. Returned here to BC, sort of 15 years later, after getting some further education in the United States. And I developed kind of a strong interest in what I would describe, and I think you can relate to this given your own work, the interface between the state and the market.
Yes.
And industry organizations, industry associations, think tanks are good places to be if one has an intellectual inclination that way, because they kind of put you in the middle, right in the middle of the equation. And you get to see, you work a lot with government and policy issues, but you actually spend a fair amount of time with entrepreneurs and corporate executives as well. So it's a good kind of opportunity to see those two worlds, how they intersect and how they sometimes collide. And so I found that very kind of fascinating throughout my career.
Well, yeah, I've noticed in the academic world, the teaching of economics is often an isolated business. It's assumes a bunch of things like open, free, competitive markets, transparent prices, a bunch of things that aren't always the way it is. And, you have to talk a little bit about these other actors who have a significant impact on how economic activity occurs. So being right at that interface must made for a fascinating career. And since you've been doing this for a while now, and we'll start talking about some of the economic issues. We'll start with a bit broader stuff and then drill down to more specific contemporary stuff. What have been kind of the major challenges, issues you've seen the Canadian body politic, body economic have to deal with over the course of your career? How has it changed, migrated, and what are the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, well, that's a big topic to unpack. But I guess I would say, over the course of my career working on Canadian public policy, particularly economic issues, for the business community, on behalf of the business community for most of that period. Canada has become a much larger country demographically. In fact, we now have the fastest growing population by far of any advanced economy jurisdiction, which I wouldn't have necessarily expected, 20 or 30 years ago, but that's where we are today. We've become more, we've had globalization, although I think it's in retreat now, but we had several decades of what I would call progressive globalization, countries getting more involved in global markets, trade growing as a share of national income or GDP, more nations like China and India and others, in a sense, entering the global marketplace in a more fulsome sort of manner. Rapid increases in cross-border capital flows, both direct foreign investment, but also portfolio flows. And then obviously with the communication and technology revolution in the 80s and 90s, the rapid sort of dissemination of information across borders, really, just by pressing a button. So all of this, knitted together a more integrated and open global economy. And Canada was very much a part of that. We became less insular, more linked with the foreign markets, more dependent on portfolio flows of capital in particular. And then, of course, we had the free trade saga with the United States that kind of stretched over the late 1980s, early 1990s. I was working in Ottawa actually during that period, and was actually quite heavily involved on behalf of my employer in advocating for the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. So that was a fascinating kind of period. So Canada became, more integrated in the North American sense. And that's kind of where we find ourselves today. So that's been one trend. The other is obviously driven by technology and innovation. We have a very different, I think, kind of capitalist world today than we had 40 or 50 years ago. You look at the market capitalization of publicly traded companies in the United States on the S&P 500, for example, it's somewhere between 75 and 85% of market cap is linked to intangible capital that's on the balance sheets, or even in many cases not on the balance sheets of these enterprises, rather than physical capital, which is buildings, equipment, machinery, things you can touch and feel. Intangible capital, you don't really see it. It's things like data, software, R&D, brand value, organizational capital that's really hard to measure if you're an economist. But a lot of the most valuable companies in the world are actually built much more on intangible patents, intellectual property. They're built on those kinds of things, not on huge factories and, large kind of production lines that we might associate it with a different kind of industrial era. So Canada, our economy's been obviously profoundly affected by that. And I think Canada has struggled to some extent because a lot of our historical wealth creation has come out of industries that are based much more on tangible capital than intangible. And I think that's some of the challenge that we're having in advancing prosperity today. The other thing is, I lived through the period of the Quebec referendum. I had just moved to Vancouver. I remember sitting in a corporate boardroom on the night of the Quebec referendum in 1995. And those of you with a bit of gray hair may recall that it was a very, very close vote as Quebec was going to separate from Canada. And that was a bit of a preoccupation of many of our elites at the time. We had earlier, when Brian Mulroney was prime minister, there were various attempts at constitutional change, the Meech Lake Accord, the Charlottetown Accord. We had a national referendum on the Charlottetown Agreement, which went down in flames. So I was kind of personally involved in a lot of that activity on behalf of the corporate community as well. That seems to have gone quiet, which I think is fortunate in recent decades. The sort of press for constitutional change and the sort of uncertainty about Quebec's place within the Federation, that's very much calmed down. But, it could come back. I'm not convinced that we're done with it yet by any means. And that's obviously very destabilizing to the economy and particularly to business confidence. If you've got a sort of high level of uncertainty about the future of your own nation, how it's going to be comprised and what the governance arrangements are going to be, that obviously is going to be a concern to large companies and to investors. And at the moment, we're not in that situation, but I do see some risk of that. And then the final thing I'll just mention, because it's so obvious, is the United States. Never has America loomed larger in terms of Canada's well-being and most of my friends who are interested in politics pay very little attention to what's going on in Ottawa. They're riveted on developments in the United States, partly because of the entertainment value, but also partly because of just the sheer consequence of it for Canada and I think for the world. And America is going through a very turbulent period in its politics. The American economy is a fantastic success story in my view, but its political system, I think, has got a lot of features that are somewhat troubling, and one really wonders where things are going to go. The U.S. Congress hasn't passed a proper budget in over a decade. They do these kind of patchwork appropriation bills to keep the lights on and keep the government open, but they seem to be incapable of making the kinds of decisions that are routinely made in other Western democracies by national legislatures and parliaments, like passing a full budget, for a given year. That seems to be beyond them. So there's a lot of dysfunction, I think, in American politics, and I certainly worry about that from the perspective of how we might be affected in Canada, and that's a top of mind concern with the U.S. election looming and the uncertainty about what the political lay of the land is going to look like on November, by the time we get to the middle of November or the start of next year. Presumably there will be a winner of the presidential race, but how that all plays out, I think, is a bit of a source of uncertainty at the moment for Canada as well as for the U.S., of course.
Well, okay, there's a lot there. I'll drill down a couple of things. I mean, I too remember most of that. I can certainly remember, how free trade, there was this significant constituency in Canada that didn't want us to open up on the free trade front or even the capital front, and we wanted to keep the borders up high. So we're seeing a bit of that today in a resurgence of protectionism for different reasons, perhaps, but that's something that's quite clear. Secondarily, the second thing I noticed about the same time is we wanted, would I say this? For example, we wanted to say diversify our trade relationships away from the United States, despite the immense gravitational pull. And I remember these sort of Team Canada trade and investment missions that was trying to tell the world why they should come to Canada. I mean, it seems like we need to keep selling ourselves a little bit, particularly in those issues, those areas you were talking about, like high tech, right? We know about wood and we know about oil and gas, but right now the vast bulk of the world's wealth is tied up in those intangibles. So it seems like we're kind of not quite sure what we're trying to do collectively.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good characterization. I'm not sure we're alone in that. I think the some of the forces you're referencing are creating challenges for many Western democratic kind of market economies, not just Canada. But I would say as somebody who was quite heavily involved in promoting the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement in the late '80s and then later the NAFTA agreement in the early '90s. I mean, it produced positive outcomes, I think, in a lot of ways, but there are also some disappointments. And the biggest one for me is standard economic trade theory would say that if you open your market and you get into a free trade agreement of the kind we did with the United States, that should actually accelerate productivity growth, particularly in the jurisdiction of the smaller market. And that was one of the expectations, I think, certainly that economists had. And the academic economics community was almost uniformly supportive of entering into a free trade deal with the U.S. And then NAFTA later. Not quite 100%, but it was overwhelming support. And one of the reasons for that, an important reason for it, was the assumption that this would drive improvements in productivity and innovation in the Canadian economy over time. And that's I think we've obviously come up short on that. So that's one of the puzzles is why. It's not entirely clear to me. I don't really have a convincing answer for it, but certainly it's something that's been one of the areas maybe we haven't maximized the benefits that should have come from free trade. But protectionism, Canada was founded on a protectionist construct. Sir John A. Macdonald's national policy was about putting up barriers, obviously in a very different time, but putting up barriers in order to support the development of a Canadian manufacturing and industrial base, very much in central Canada. Didn't work so well for the Western provinces, but it was helpful, I think, for Upper Canada and Lower Canada, that later became Ontario and Quebec, to develop kind of a nascent industrial economy. And other nations, the US, Germany, did the same. Then we had this long period of more open trade, especially after World War II. And now I think we're going a little bit the other way. And it's not a made in Canada thing. It's a phenomenon we're seeing certainly in the United States, and I think in Europe and elsewhere. And it's partly because geopolitics has reasserted itself. I know you've written about this, concerns about national security, energy security, the vulnerability that countries face from far-flung supply chains that involve doing business with adversaries, or countries that we're not politically aligned with. A lot of that came to the fore during the pandemic, of course, but then it was really reinforced, I think, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then earlier than that, President Trump's first term, where he really changed the dial quite fundamentally on the narrative coming out of the Republican Party about economics. It previously was quite free market oriented, supportive of global trade and free trade agreements and so on. And Trump really walked that back almost 180 degrees into I would describe it as a mercantilist kind of mindset that says we don't want to get dependent on foreigners for vital goods and services. And because we're the big dog in the room, the United States, we're going to use our market power to hammer other people by putting tariffs up or threatening to put tariffs up in order to get whatever it is we want. So it's a very different dynamic politically. I think the World Trade Organization, I would say the World Trade Organization, the WTO, it is the main global body to sort of oversee multilateral trade rules and provide a framework for negotiating, multilateral agreements. I mean, it's essentially on its deathbed as we speak here today. It's hanging by a thread. There's no momentum whatsoever in the world today for an ambitious round of global multilateral trade talks. That's just not going to happen. And even on the regional basis, the United States has basically walked away from, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Arrangement that America was the initiator of under President Obama in the latter part of his administration. I mean, that's been, Trump pulled out of it on the first day. And President Biden hasn't seen fit to revisit the decision. So there are a lot of headwinds at the moment, I think, to further global economic integration. And there is some walking back, I think, away from the kind of agreements that were in place or under development sort of 10 years ago. So where we settle in the new kind of equilibrium, I don't know. But for Canada, it's a very challenging environment because we really bet a lot on the robustness of a multilateral trading system, of what political scientists call a rules-based international order, where small countries, aren't at the mercy of the bigger ones, and rules matter more than power. And I really think that's in flux at the moment, and it's going to be an enormous challenge, I think, for the Canadian political establishment to figure out if this is the way the world's going to go, into a more mercantilist, less collaborative kind of model where power matters more than law and rules. I mean, where do we fit in that? And how do we position ourselves so that we'll be successful? I think we've got a lot of hard work to do among our decision makers to sort of figure that out. And I'm not being critical of them. I think it's a huge, we're really on the horns of a dilemma there with that fundamental shift, I think, that's occurring.
Well, I mean, a couple of things there. I think I would even go farther. Not only is the United States, it has got in its head that not only should it enhance its own welfare, but that everybody else has been getting their welfare at their expense. Like other countries have gotten strong because we have been open. It's almost overly aggressive in that way. And that includes us. I mean, one of the things I sometimes tell my classes and tell my public audiences is that it's a myth that the United States is always Canada's friend.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. Now, I'd like to, I know you about the beginning of that question, you don't really say exactly why we've had some challenges in productivity, but I think we're going to have to at least try to guess at some. I mean, this is kind of the bugbear of Canadian economics for the last 20 years. I mean, we have and productivity, output per unit per worker compared to our comparator states, particularly the United States, has fallen pretty stagnant, and theirs has gone up. And the gap between the two just keeps getting bigger. And I remember finance ministers in the year 2000, 2002, 2005 saying we need to fix this.
Yeah.
And it's only gotten worse. So yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit about that and then maybe get into the energy sector a bit as perhaps a way to, solve some of this.
Well, it's the elephant in the room, I think, although it tends to be a quiet elephant, but it's looming there. So just, productivity we define as the easiest way to do it is the value of what we produce per hour of labor. We call that labor productivity. And we've got very good data on that across jurisdictions. So you can kind of measure your where you sit and what your growth dynamics are compared to others. So Canada, the US, we would conventionally define as at the frontier. It typically leads all of the market economies in its level of productivity, and that's not new. That's been the case throughout my working career. Canada used to be closer. So when I actually started my career, we would have been, at some points, 80, 85, even 90% of the U.S. level of private sector productivity output per hour worked. We've really been in retreat relative to them, essentially during the 2000s. It really gathered momentum kind of at the turn of the century, sort of 2000, and it's been continuous since then. It's been particularly bad, our performance in the last decade. We've really slipped. So why does it matter? It's because most people are not particularly preoccupied with this. It matters because in the long run, the ability to grow real wages and real incomes for Canadians hinges more than on anything else. It hinges on how productive we are as an economy. I'm not talking about individuals here, it's the aggregate. So how productive is the Canadian economy? How much output can we produce for 1 hour of labor? And how are we doing on that metric compared to others? So the trends are deeply, deeply troubling. And they've gotten quite a bit worse in the last decade, as I mentioned. And we're finally seeing a bit of attention being paid to this. Certainly in the business community and among think tanks, I don't see much evidence that the government of Canada is seized with it, and that really concerns me, because I'll just do a contrast between Canada and Australia. One of my good friends, former colleague, is a PhD economist who used to work in the Australian Public Service, and then he worked in the Bank of Canada, and now he's here in Vancouver. He likes to point out that Australia, for 20 years, Australia's had a National Productivity Commission that is charged with, shining a bright light on Australia's performance in various areas that affect productivity, and both absolutely and how Australia is doing compared to peer jurisdictions. And this is something that is strongly supported by all the political parties in Australia. The Productivity Commission has persisted through multiple changes of national government and political strife in Australia. And the work that the commission does actually gets covered by the national media, like including television. So they have a much more robust kind of discussion in the public sphere and in their national parliament about how important productivity is, even though they're actually doing better than we are in Canada. In Canada, we have absolutely nothing. I plowed through all the speeches of the current prime minister about a year ago to try and identify if he'd ever turned his attention to this topic, and I was unable to find any evidence that it was something he'd ever spoken to publicly.
In 9 years.
Yeah, now we had the COVID pandemic. I mean, there's a few things that interrupted, but I think it's quite telling. There's a deep sort of, I think, and totally unwarranted complacency among the decision makers in Ottawa that this is not something that we should be terribly worried about. And that concerns me, because if we continue to sort of stagnate, we're going to wake up one day in 2035 and we're going to discover that our average income relative to the US is 50%. We're going to be half as productive as America, with sort of half the level of income per person. And that's not a future that I think we want to see in Canada. So if we want to avoid that, we've got to start paying attention to this issue. Right now, we haven't really been paying attention to it, and it's not a partisan thing. It's not about blaming one party or one government. It's a national challenge. In my view, it's our actual single most important national challenge, and we need to be kind of taking the politics out of it if we can, and trying to diagnose what's gone wrong and what are the levers we can pull to start to turn things around. And there'll be lots of debate on what those are, by the way. It's not a simple list of 5 things that everybody will agree on. There's plenty of room for debate and research on this, but we got to start taking it seriously. I mean, we are so far behind the ball on that, David. We just haven't realized it's this kind of slow, genteel decline in our productivity and therefore our living standards. I do think it's starting to dawn on people. If you look at the public opinion surveys, this narrative that Canada's broken, which 70% of Canadians now, they actually agree with that statement. That wouldn't have been true 20 or 30 years ago, but it's quite shocking. So I think the sense that we're stagnating, that we're kind of losing our our footing in the world, and that our standard of living is kind of under downward pressure. That is starting to galvanize, I think, more attention in the public domain, and maybe eventually we'll see a focus, in government on it. We certainly don't at the moment. And by the way, the same is true provincially. Your province of Ontario, it has a conservative government, but from what I've been able to see here in Vancouver, it's not a government that's paid too much attention to these issues. So.
Well, one of the things that I also impart is it has been at least 2 decades in the making. So it's not as if one government is solely responsible. And it's going to take more than the term of one to fix it. But secondarily, why is economic growth good? Like a lot of people think, well, it's because it also funds everything else you want to do. If you want to have a robust social programs, robust medical systems, robust educational, that costs money, all of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we can't afford unless we have a solid growth pattern to be able to do this. So links between the economics and the social side, I think, also need to be.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I've been on CBC panels and various public fora where this issue of growth, do we need economic growth? Often people who come from the political left or who are particularly concerned with environmental matters will say, we actually need degrowth because too much growth is bad for the environment, and you economists are way too preoccupied with GDP, gross domestic product per person, and GDP is a very broad measure of well-being. It doesn't capture everything that's important, for sure. But if you look around the world at the countries that have the highest levels of what we call subjective happiness, subjective well-being based on surveys, if we look at the countries that have the best educated populations, that have the best healthcare systems, that have the lowest rates of poverty, have the smallest proportion of children living in poverty, all these metrics, you'll find in most cases there's a pretty strong correlation between good performance on what I would call social and environmental metrics on the one hand, and productivity and GDP per person on the other. You're not going to find very many places that have low levels of productivity that also perform well on some of these social indicators. So they are linked, and the foundation, the ability to have a strong welfare state, high environmental standards, good rule of law, decent healthcare, the foundation of that is a productive economy in the long run. Yeah. It's such an obvious point. It's trite when it sounds trite to me when I say it. And yet I really wonder whether our decision makers in the political arena understand that some days. They certainly don't talk about it very much. So
they don't act and to go beyond Canada. The number one indicator of increasing environmental awareness, increasing rights for women and education for women, all of that is predicated on economic growth.
Yeah.
Richer you are, the more you hear about such things.
Yeah, growth and growth means that you're getting more productive over time. Yeah. The main source of the healthy kind of economic growth, or the healthiest kind of economic growth, is that which comes from improvements in efficiency and productivity and innovation and new ways of doing things and deploying technology and upskilling the workforce. These are ways you can increase the value of what you're producing per hour. What we've been doing in Canada, to swing it back to the current environment a bit, is we actually have had economic growth in this country in the past 10 or 15 years. It's actually been stronger here overall than in a lot of our peer jurisdictions. But the growth we've had in our economy is due almost exclusively to more labor supply. It's basically an expanding workforce fed by record high levels of immigration. So we have more people here consuming, we have more people working, and that's producing more output. And so that's what's been driving growth. We've been getting almost no growth in the Canadian economy through gains in productivity. So it's very lopsided, and I think it's a very unstable kind of equilibrium. It's not, if we're committed to high levels of immigration, and we could debate that if we want, but the current government certainly is in Ottawa. And there's been, I think, strong support across Canada for a pretty open immigration policy, so we'll take that as a given. But those newcomers in our economy, when they arrive here, they need to work with equipment and tools and technology to make them productive. So you need a lot of investment in both private and public capital to ensure you can maximize the benefits of the growing population. We have really fallen short on that. We've been growing the population, but we haven't commensurately been building up the capital stock, if you will, to allow them to be productive and also provide the services that they need once they get here. So Canada, I think we really need a pretty fundamental rethink of how we're going to grow our economy in the future. In my view, it should be heavily focused on becoming more productive and much less focused on adding millions of people to the existing population through, very aggressive immigration. I'd actually dial the immigration back quite significantly from where it is today and focus more on investment and productivity. I think that's a much healthier kind of place to land.
Well, one of the things that Canada has been lauded for is we had a very effective immigration policy for decades, where the immigration levels were kept up with the investments that were necessary for schools and hospitals and housing, to integrate them effectively. And over the last couple of years, we seem to have taken, it sounds crass, taken too many in to be able to absorb that way, and it's accentuated all these other issues.
No, totally. And it's a bit perplexing. I mean, when the current prime minister came to office, we were already quite an immigration intensive country. We were bringing in 270,000 permanent immigrants a year, and we had some temporaries coming in, non-permanent as well. It's not as if we didn't have immigration in 2015. We had lots of immigration, but for reasons that I don't think were ever well explained to Canadians or even to members of Parliament, the current government decided we would double the annual intake of permanent immigrants over time. So we've gone from 250 or 60,000 in 2015 up to basically 500,000 a year now. That's on the permanent side. And to your point, we didn't invest in the infrastructure and services to actually make that work, in my view. There was some, but totally inadequate. Then we opened the doors on the non-permanent side to essentially unlimited inflows coming out of COVID, both for international students and also temporary foreign workers. We've also had people coming here from Ukraine and elsewhere who are political refugees or asylum seekers. That's a different category. So the net result is in 2023, we had 1.3 million people.
That's a lot.
Which is larger than the population of Calgary, Alberta, one of our biggest cities.
Sure. In 1 year.
Coming into Canada. And from what I could tell, and living here in Vancouver, we really do see the impact of this quite clearly. As near as I can tell, that inflow was it wasn't preceded by any planning, any coordination, any preparation whatsoever between the different levels of government. It was really federal government policy to grow the population at a record pace, and it was left to others to sort of worry about how we're going to make that work. And of course, I think it's been a calamitous failure. And so now even the current government in Ottawa, they're sort of sheepishly walking back from the commitments they made 2 or 3 years ago. So the lesson there is, if we're going to have aggressive immigration targets and we want to make it work for the well-being of the whole country, including newcomers, we need to be going about it in a different way than has been exhibited under the current government. We need a sort of a fresh approach and rethink that'll involve a lot more preparation, planning, coordination. On the business side, if we're going to grow the workforce through high levels of immigration, we need a heck of a lot more business investment. To put the capital stock in place to make those people productive. We haven't been doing that. Business investment's been declining in Canada, certainly relative to the United States and even relative to our own past. So there's an area. I mean, I don't have a magic solution to our productivity problem, David, but one thing I know for sure is we're going to have to invest more in things that make us productive. So that's both tangible capital, machinery, equipment, engineering infrastructure, but it's also intangible capital, R&D, patents, software, data, skill upgrading and training for workers. All of those things are important. And we're going to have to up our game on all those areas if we're going to turn around this productivity mess. But the painful truth is if we invest more, we're going to have to consume less. And this is where the politics gets very, very challenging. We have governments, I would say, certainly at the national level and absolutely here in British Columbia, where I live, that are much more focused on promoting consumption through, and often for good reasons. It's not, I mean, I have some sympathy with how we've ended up here. But we're sort of promoting this consumption-driven economy when our deficiencies are not in consumption, they're in what we're investing to make us productive in the long run. So we're going to have to, cut back a bit on consumption and start investing more in things that make us productive. Otherwise, there's no hope of turning around our lackluster productivity. We are not going to turn it around by consuming more. No, we're going to turn it around by investing more and innovating more. And that's where the policy focus needs to be directed. And maybe it'll come. I'm not sure, but in my view, that's the direction we need to take if we want Canada to become more of a leader and less of a laggard among our peer jurisdictions on these key measures of well-being and prosperity.
Well, there's three themes I've just mentioned that I think are critical to Canada's future. One of them is knowledge capital, innovation, creativity. Another one is regulatory burden, which I will argue at the local, provincial, and federal level is pretty heavy. So that dissuades business investment because it's harder to deploy. And thirdly is productivity. The test case, the test industry for all those things is energy. Yeah. Right. And I know you've written a lot on energy and recently you've done it about lower living standards. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit about how the energy sector in Canada has had to adapt to all of this and what's going on in your view?
Yeah, that's a great question. And energy looms large in the Canadian economic narrative. There's no doubt about it. We should just back up for a sec and ask two questions. One, about our own consumption of energy as a society, and the second is the energy we produce, because they're not quite the same thing. So energy consumption in Canada, about one fifth of it comes from electricity. I think a lot of Canadians think electricity is a much bigger portion of our total energy demand. That's not the case. So electricity supplies about a fifth, actually a bit less than a fifth, 17%. The latest data I saw of total Canadian primary energy demand. Virtually all the rest of it comes from fossil fuels that are used for transportation, for the heating and cooling of buildings, for industrial processes, and also for agriculture. All of those areas are primarily powered, if you will, by fossil fuels, not by renewable electricity. So that's on the consumption. And over time, as a society, we want to, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we want and we will need to reduce the dependence on fossil fuels as a source of energy to meet local demand in Canada. But that's going to take decades, a lot longer. It isn't done by these politically manufactured timelines, but it will happen through technology, innovation, and the replacement of the capital stock. So that's on the consumption. On the production side, the picture is a bit different. Canada is a very large net exporter of energy. In fact, it's our number one source of export earnings by far. Nothing else is even close. It's up to 20, depending on the year and oil prices and global demand, et cetera. Energy can make up to a quarter of Canada's total export portfolio. More than $200 billion a year of export earnings from the energy sector. And within that, oil and gas are 85 to 90%. The vast majority of our energy exports come out of the traditional hydrocarbon-based energy industries. And that has actually been growing. A lot of Canadians, I don't think, realize we've had a strong policy focus on climate change mitigation, and I fully understand why. But all through that period, we've actually been producing and exporting more energy particularly both crude oil, refined, other oil-based products, natural gas, and starting next year, liquefied natural gas will begin exporting from the West Coast. So as a country, we are very, very heavily dependent on energy to fuel our export earnings. And I would remind people that the way we pay for imports ultimately is by having exports.
Right.
The reason you want exports is not because they're good in and of themselves. It's because they furnish the economic means to pay for imports. And imports hugely expand our standard of living as a country. So we want imports, and we need to find a way to pay for them. The main way we're going to pay for them is by having industries that can actually export. And on that list, energy is number one by a wide margin, and that's not going to change. No. Some politicians may hope it will change, but it's not going to change, not in the near term. I guess in the long term it will. So energy is our number one export industry. The other thing is it's a very high productivity industry. The value of what is produced out of the energy sector per hour of work is 4 or 5 times higher than the average for all industries combined. Mm-hmm. So it is quite literally our most productive major industry. And that's shown by the very high wages and employment earnings that you see in the energy sector. Alberta, next door to me here in Vancouver, household incomes and average wages are substantially higher than they are in BC. And the main reason is the energy sector. It really drives in Alberta, heavily concentrated. So energy is an industry where our current and our future prosperity will hinge to a very large extent, I think, on how successful we are in retaining a strong, competitive, vibrant, globally competitive energy sector, one that's going to have to reduce its carbon intensity over time, though. I mean, there's no question in my mind that is the world we're in, where we need to look for ways to get emissions down. But we don't do that by shutting the industry down, in my view. We do it by investing in technology and innovation to improve efficiency and therefore take some of the carbon out of the production process. So energy is big, and I know obviously here in Western Canada we're quite focused on it because even here in BC we're a big producer of natural gas. So we sort of see the energy sector. Ontario, Quebec, I think it's maybe not as clear to people how important it is in the overall Canadian picture, but it really is at the heart of it's the beating heart of the Canadian export economy, energy.
Yeah, and it's always been surprising to me that this wasn't as well understood outside of the producing areas as it probably should be. Transfer payments for social programs. Alberta's funded something like $600 billion over the past, couple of decades. I mean, it's an enormous thing. And it also exemplifies some of the challenges we have on productivity and competitiveness, largely on the regulatory burdens. I mean, for example, we just finished the Trans Mountain pipeline, but it took 9 years to build and cost overruns. And a lot of that was due to just incessant regulatory oversight that just stops stuff.
Yeah.
And so how do we kind of overcome a bit of, and we're alluding to what you said earlier, it also raises uncertainties for foreign investors about whether they're going to go. We've also got an American neighbor who is a very attractive investment target. So, it really is double and triple whamming on our producers to have all those extra burdens placed on them.
It is, yeah, and it's amazing they've been able to navigate through the last decade or so. We had oil prices collapsing in 2014-15. Then we had, the election of a national government that I would describe as hostile to the energy sector or disinterested in it. And we had the Keystone Pipeline canceled to the United States. We had these unbelievable delays in completing the Trans Mountain pipeline, which, by the way, was not a new pipeline. It was an expansion of existing pipeline. And then all the hiccups around trying to develop a liquefied natural gas industry here in BC. And yet the Canadian sector has survived it. One of the enormous ironies, and I know you know a lot about the oil and gas business, but one of the incredible ironies for me is Justin Trudeau's father, and I sort of started my career in the very end of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's tenure as prime minister. One of his goals was to Canadianize the oil and gas industry. In other words, repatriate ownership of the oil patch from global companies, mainly American ones, to Canadian-based companies, which is one of the reasons why they created Petro-Canada as a federal crown corporation. Here we are under in the tenure of his son, Justin Trudeau, as prime minister, who has been not particularly welcoming to the oil and gas industry. He doesn't like to talk about it very much. And yet, we now, under his tenure, we've had almost a complete repatriation of ownership. The oil and gas business back to Canada. The global companies have largely left Canada, and the Canadian giants like Suncor, Cenovus, Canadian Natural Resources, and a few others have actually bought up their stakes. So now the upstream oil and gas industry in Canada is largely Canadian owned. Very, very different from the picture that we had when Mr. Trudeau Sr. was prime minister. And this wasn't planned, but it's kind of one of the ironic results of the path we've been on. But yes, the regulatory complexity is enormous. It's grown by leaps and bounds over time, not just for energy, but certainly energy is very much in the window, I think, when we talk about this. And but there's also a lot of political contention around it. There are a lot of people who want to produce less evidence. They want to accelerate the pace of the industry. They're not a majority, but they're vocal, and they have some. There's lots of very smart people that lots of them working in universities actually who are onto this theme, and lots of young people. I lecture in classes and so on. Lots of young people very animated by worries over climate change, and they think we should be winding down oil and gas production, even though global demand and consumption keep going up. And so that's created the environment, if you will, the political environment within which this regulatory burden has kept growing. So I do think we need to streamline and find ways. We need to find ways to do stuff more quickly. If we're going to build a pipeline, let's build it. Let's not spend a decade monkeying around getting it done. If we're going to have a permitting system that allows industry to operate, let's make it efficient. You can have high standards, and I think in Canada we have to have high environmental standards because our public wants it, and we're still a prosperous jurisdiction that has a responsibility to do that. But what we don't need is years and years and years of process before we put a shovel in the ground. And that is going to require a real, political commitment, not just at the national level, but also by the provinces. They have a lot of the jurisdiction. If we see a change in government at the federal level, I think we may begin to see a move in the direction of regulatory streamlining that essentially takes some of the cost and the delay out of getting stuff done. It shouldn't take, the government of Canada wants to see the critical minerals industry develop in Canada. These are the mining companies and operations that produce minerals needed for the clean energy transition. Copper, nickel, and all rare earth metals. There's sort of a list of 17 of them. Canada's got a tremendous endowment of mineral resources, so we could, and we have a history as a mining jurisdiction, so we could be in on the game as global demand quadruples for critical minerals in the next 20 years. But if we're going to do that, we've got to make it easier to build a new mine here. It can't take 20 years to get all the approvals and the permits to develop a mine. We should be doing it in 4 or 5 years or less. And that's going to require a complete overhaul of the environmental assessment and permitting systems at the federal level, but also in the provinces. And there is some momentum building for that. I'm moderately, optimistic on that front. Because I think it is clear that the current natural resource minister has admitted publicly, who's from Vancouver, he's admitted publicly that we simply have to make changes to how long it takes to get things built. So I think there is a bit of a recognition on that.
Well, there's regulatory systems. What about tax? I think you've written a bit on that. Our tax system.
Yeah, I think on the business side, we used to have actually a tax advantage over the United States. Our average corporate tax rates were lower than in the US. And what we call our average effective tax rates, which take into account depreciation schedules and investment tax credits and things like that, they looked pretty good too relative to the US. In 2017-18, the Americans overhauled, when Trump was president, they overhauled their tax system. And that included a dramatic reduction in the US federal corporate tax rate. It went from, I think it was 35%, all down to like 21%, the basic corporate tax rate. They also brought in during the COVID crisis, and even before it, they brought in accelerated write-offs for corporate investment in infrastructure and things like that. So basically what's happened is on the business side, the advantage we used to have over the United States in the overall tax burden on business, that suddenly disappeared. And we're now either a little ahead or a little behind the US in tax competitiveness, depending on which study that you look at. The problem is what used to be a Canadian advantage has gone away. So that's a problem, because in the North American context, most of the people, most of the wealth, most of the economic activity, most of the business activity takes place in the United States. We're like on the northern periphery, if you think about it, of the United States. We're 8% of North America in terms of GDP. And the natural tendency of capital and talent is to migrate to the sort of core market. And we're not that. Ontario's at least kind of on the periphery of it a bit, with given your geography. But Canada as a whole, we're on the sort of northern edge of the overall North American economic space. So we need to find ways to put Canada on the table as an option for companies to invest and innovate and put head offices and deploy capital. And we used to have our tax system was an advantage at one point in time. It no longer is. So that is something that the government of Canada could look at. The problem is government also needs revenue, and it's easy to talk about massive tax cuts, and a lot of people on the right of the political spectrum, where I actually put myself, a lot of people are very quick to say we've got to dramatically cut taxes. But if you're going to do that, and you're not going to run larger deficits, you're going to have some tough conversations about spending programs. And I'm not sure that Canadians are kind of there at the moment. Or you can be like the U.S. The U.S. I read the platforms of both the Democrats and the Republican candidates for president, and there's absolutely no concern in either platform about U.S. fiscal sustainability. The U.S. federal budget deficit is 7% of gross domestic product this year, even though the economy is booming. Ours is about 2%. So the Americans have become very profligate in their approach to fiscal policy, and they're the world's reserve currency. They maybe get away with that, but we can't in Canada.
No, we can't. I mean, there's no evidence that people are less willing to lend money to the United States, no matter what their deficits are, it seems.
Yes.
But that's not the case for us.
It certainly isn't. And
I would also...
So tax, I mean, yes, I think if we're going to make Canada more competitive, I would put a lot of emphasis on regulatory streamlining and reform, partly because there's no fiscal cost to doing that. That would be my main area where I'd be, and also interprovincial trade barriers, finding ways to speed up the accreditation of new immigrants who come here with qualifications, and then they can't find employment that is linked to their previous education and experience before they arrived in Canada. I would be looking for things that we can do to make our business environment more competitive and more nimble without incurring an enormous fiscal burden on governments. Tax, I would look at, how can we make the tax system more efficient, smarter, not necessarily reducing the total revenues that are collected, because I'm not convinced that's doable. I mean, we're running deficits even today at the federal level. BC, we have a record deficit, by the way, provincially. So if we want to be fiscally prudent, we have to find ways to generate revenue. Regulatory reform can help, though. It's like it's almost free money for us because our regulatory systems are so awful, so constipated. They're adding so much cost and delay to getting anything done that if we can change those and make them more efficient, we can grow the economy more quickly, and that'll help to spin off extra revenues for government to pay for stuff. So there is really a win-win there, I think, through a policy of smart regulation. But it's going to take a lot of political determination to go in that direction because it represents a shift from the trends that we've been seeing in the past decade.
Okay, so let's maybe go back out to the slightly bigger picture. I'll use a little metaphor and then we'll get into it. One of the interesting things I learned about doing a podcast is I actually do not look when I'm on a screen anything at all like what I think I look like. Like your self-perception of who and what you are is not the same as what the rest of the world often sees. Now, using that little metaphor for Canada, I wonder if we think we talk about this privately. We pride ourselves to being part of a G7 country. We're developed. But the world's changing very rapidly, and we'd like to get your thoughts about how we might want to change how we view ourselves and what the world is like, and what we would then need to do in a more realistic view of who we are.
Sure. I think the world, as you say, the world has shifted a lot. Coming out of World War II, I had uncles of mine fought in the war, and when they were alive, they used to, comment that Canada had the world's 5th biggest military at the end of World War II. I mean, that is in today's context, that sounds like science fiction. And we obviously came out of the war on the winning side, and our economy grew very, very rapidly. We had a lot of population growth. We had tremendous gains in prosperity and living standards in the 1950s and 60s. We built the welfare state. We were a bigger part of the global economy in those days than we are today. We've been shrinking. So just to put some numbers on it, Canada's 2% of the global economy. That is the value of global production. We're 3% of the market capitalization of publicly traded enterprises on all the stock markets across the world. Canada's 3%. We're maybe 4% of the value of world trade, 4 or 5, depending on commodity prices. And when it comes to innovation and technology, we're a very, very, very small piece of the new production of all of that. So we're a small economy, a small open economy that's very dependent on trade. And I think we need to revamp our mindset a little bit about where we fit in the world and start with that. Instead of saying we're actually a big country with big geography and we're part of the G7 and we're part of NATO and we're a relatively wealthy country, we sort of count for a lot in the world. The world listens to Canada. The sad
Okay. We'll be able to edit that out. Go ahead.
So Canada, small, my kind of starting point analytically, we're a small open economy. How do we make our way in a world where we actually don't have a lot of influence? We're price takers for what we produce for the most part. That means we don't really determine the market prices of what we export. So we've got to worry about our cost structure, about our innovation. And if you look at countries like Finland, Denmark, Estonia, Singapore, I've actually studied these places a little bit. Their decision makers, their elites in the public and private sector, very much have a shared understanding of where they are, of their place in the world, their country's place in the world. Denmark is not under any illusions that it has a lot of market power in Europe or globally. They recognize they've got to, they've got to nurture their comparative advantages, figure out what they can produce and export to create the income flows that will allow them to be prosperous. And we need that kind of mindset, I think, to develop in Canada. And it's not, it doesn't come easily because we really haven't had that. We haven't been looking at the world through that kind of a lens for a long time. It's changing. I think there is some recognition of it now, but it's a slow process. So I see Canada as sort of, we have a lot of assets, but we're in a very, very competitive kind of an environment. And our global influence is diminishing over time. And I don't think there's much we can do about it, frankly. I think it's sort of hardwired into the way the world is evolving. And we need to position ourselves based on that kind of realization.
Well, a couple more questions. One of them now, I know you're an economist and we don't want to dabble too much into politics, but we've got some elections coming up. And you've spoken throughout this podcast that you sort of sense there's a bit of a change in Canadians' attitudes towards economic matters, at least a little bit. Can you sort of, I don't want you to go too far in the politics role, but sort of say, how do you think, will we wake up to these realities and maybe do something, or do you think we're still kind of treading water here?
Yeah, well, I'm outside my wheelhouse where I can lay claim to having much expertise, or certainly not any comparative advantage. But I guess my observation as a citizen would be the combination of the stagnation of Canadian productivity essentially over the last decade, which begins to weigh on the growth of incomes and wages and so on, coupled with the shock of the pandemic that all countries went through, and then the inflation surge in 2021, 2, and 3 that really caught people by surprise, including policymakers, and has driven up costs for Canadian households. So, the price level is 20% higher today. The level of the consumer price index is basically 20% higher today than it was at the start of 2020. The price of food is 25% higher than it was at the beginning of 2020. Shelter is 24% higher costs for Canadians today compared to where it was in January of 2020. So people have absorbed all of this, and it has obviously had political repercussions. If you look at public opinion polls, the top issues of concern for Canadians have shifted. Before COVID, climate change was up at the top. Now it's sort of in the butt. It's not in the top 5 anymore. So there's a real concern, I think, about I would call bread and butter sort of economic issues, affordability.
Literally bread and butter.
Literally bread and butter, but also housing and sort of basic services. And a concern, I mean, we've had high rates of employment. In fact, the employment to population ratio has never been higher in Canada than it was in 2023. But the incomes people are generating from employment, I think a lot of folks think it's not enough to, reach a middle class standard of living, et cetera. So I think that is playing out in the political arena, and it's put the current federal government, I think, in a very difficult spot, because until recently, their priorities were climate change, Indigenous reconciliation, and diversity, equity, inclusion. Those are the 3 big narratives that one heard coming out, and they were elected, by the way, on platforms that put a lot of emphasis on those things. And those are all important. They're not going away, but they're not quite as important to the public as they were before COVID. And in my province here in British Columbia, we're in the middle of an election campaign. We have a left-leaning government that's been in power for 7 years and was also very, very invested in what I would describe as non-economic priorities for most of the last 7 years. And in the campaign, there's been a complete pivot away from that. And the premier and his colleagues are now talking about cutting income taxes for middle-income households, providing subsidies for people to buy groceries, scrapping the carbon tax, which was a signature policy embraced by the government.
NDP government.
And they were fully committed to a rising carbon tax over time, and now they have really opened the door to potentially getting rid of it completely. And that would not have happened if the political environment and the public opinion environment hadn't shifted pretty dramatically. So I sort of infer from what I'm observing that the politicians, who after all do need to have their finger on the pulse of public opinion for career reasons, the politicians have sensed that the landscape has shifted in terms of the top issues that people care about, and they're responding accordingly. So that's actually a positive thing, in my view, because we're getting closer to the, I would describe as kind of the mainstream economic issues that I think we haven't been paying enough attention to in Canada for the last decade.
All right. Well, just the last one more question is just how are you spending your time now? What projects are you kind of working on? And
yeah, well, I spent about a day a week here doing work with the Fraser Institute. So I'm working on a paper on. I just finished a paper on the decarbonizing electricity generation in Canada, which is one of the planks of the climate change policy adopted by the Trudeau government and embraced by a number of the provinces as well, is to remove the remaining fossil fuel generation from the electricity grid across Canada. It's primarily Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Nova Scotia are the three provinces that are most dependent on fossil fuel-fired electricity. Ontario has some as well in terms of natural gas. Ontario has gotten rid of its coal-based electricity. So we did a paper on looking at what would be required to actually fully decarbonize electricity in Canada, and what that might cost, and what some of the challenges would be around. You mentioned the regulatory system. A fundamental challenge is how long it takes to get things approved and permitted, whether it's a wind farm, a transmission line, a new hydroelectric generating facility, let alone things like nuclear, which potentially a very important source of power in the future outside of Ontario. It already is in Ontario. So if governments are serious about decarbonizing the electricity sector, again, we've got to change the regulatory system to take out cost and delay. I'm also doing some work on immigration, really around if we're going to have high levels of immigration into Canada, which until recently there was I would say, a pretty strong consensus on that. How do we maximize the economic well-being and the economic benefits of the country from high levels of immigration? So what are some of the missing pieces that we need to sort of include in that? That's an area. And then I'm doing a certain amount of work for the construction industry, as I mentioned at the outset, in BC and Alberta, on housing affordability, how to speed up the construction process in order to get things built more quickly. And again, back to your regulatory theme, there's a lot of regulatory issues in the construction domain that are quite important if you want to improve productivity and efficiency. You obviously have to do that while maintaining employee health and safety and things like that. So it's tricky, but we can borrow from best practices around the world. There's lots of places that do it better than we do, whether it's building pipelines or building condominium projects, frankly. And I'd like to hope we could look and borrow some of the ideas that have really worked well in other advanced economy jurisdictions that tend to be more nimble and efficient than we are, which, by the way, doesn't include the United States. Their problems are just as great as ours in a lot of these areas. But some of the European countries, as well as Korea and Japan, are much more efficient in their regulatory processes. So I'm looking at that as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the last hour and a bit of conversation. Any final sort of thoughts that you want to share before we?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to respond to these questions. And, somebody who's been working for 40 years on a lot of these issues, I got strong opinions, but I also am humble enough to realize that I could be wrong about a lot of the things I believe, or at least that there are other viewpoints that can help to illuminate some of these challenges. So I do think it's important to stay open-minded and recognize that there can be more than one way to skin a cat in this world. So, and I think that's true on economic policy as well.